Welcome to the motherfucking relay where we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, now it's time for our weekend picks. Tomorrow, Wilder-Suarez is going to be challenging the IBF champion at 154 pounds, Canada's own Marie-Eve Deker. Very charismatic character, beautiful smile, very polished boxer. Let's talk about it. Now, Wilder-Ortiz, God bless her. She's got a lot of professional experience, and she's been around. But all things considered, the vast majority of those victories that she's piled up really have been against pedestrian-level competition. So you can't let the number of victories give you a false representation of things that, yeah, okay, Wilder-Ortiz has been around a lot longer than Marie has. Wilder-Ortiz debuted in 2006, whereas Marie made her pro debut in 2015. So Wilder-Ortiz does have more pro experience, and she has been around longer, but that doesn't necessarily make her the more well-rounded fighter. And that doesn't necessarily mean that she's fought the better quality of competition. A lot of those girls that Wilder-Ortiz fought, they had losing records and losses in the double digits. Whereas, if you look over at Marie-Eve Deker's resume, the last 4 girls that she fought, well, there's a wealth of experience right then and there with the likes of a Alejandra Ayala, a Michaela Lauren, former world champion Michaela Lauren, the very game and dangerous Maria Lindbergh, and lest we forget, Chris Namis, what was the reigning IBF champion at that weight. All things considered, I'd have to say that those 4 opponents that Marie-Eve Deker beat are better than about 99% of the girls on Wilder-Ortiz's resume. So like I said, don't let the number of fights fool you into thinking that Wilder-Ortiz is something that she's not. She's a decent fighter, but she's also a very basic fighter that has been keeping busy with very pedestrian-level opponents. I'll say, to Wilder-Ortiz's credit, she's not a bad fighter. She's got some ability, some talent there. It's just that she's a good fighter. She's a very good, but very basic fighter. There's not much there in the realm of nuance and subtleties, that X factor that takes you all the way to those world titles. That's really what Wilder-Ortiz is missing, But there is some ability. I'd have to say her best combination is the straight 1-2. She does seem to generate decent power when she can get full extension on her punches, her straight punches. I'd have to say that if she's got a strong suit, that would be more or less her strong suit. And it really is mid-range to inside when she's firing off those hooks that she's vulnerable, because she doesn't have the best hand speed. The hooks themselves aren't particularly compact, and she's not quite off the center to ensure that, if something comes back at her, she won't be there to receive it. Receive it with her face, receive it with her torso. These are the weaknesses, the areas of weakness that I think Marie-Eve Deker is going to exploit. Marie-Eve Deker, who I give the edge in hand speed, the edge in foot speed, mobility, angles.
She's got it.
She can fight on the front foot. She can fight on the back foot. She's a southpaw. She's got that working for her. And that flick jab, not to be confused with a stiff or a stick jab. That flick jab out of the southpaw stance is ever present. It's a very short punch, and it usually warrants a very defensive response from her opponent, that as they're covering up to ensure that they don't get hit with that flick jab, Marie-Eve Deker inches closer and closer to get within her sweet spot, mid-range to inside, where she's very effective, very quick with her combinations, very fluid with her angles, as to stay off the center and not just stand there like a statue admiring your own work, whilst the punch finds its way to your face. Marie-Eve Deker is a very fluid fighter, both on the front foot and the back foot. She's very bouncy, and that way very creative, being able to maneuver in and out of range
At her discretion.
seamlessly. I think that even though Marie-Eve Deker may not have been around as long and doesn't have quite as many professional contests, she still is the more complete fighter, the more complete package. Thus, I am edging her to win this fight on points. Marie-Eve Deker, very skilled boxer, very polished, not the biggest punches. For this reason, I think it's going to go to the cards. But I do think she's going to have her way with Wilder-Suarez. I think the aesthetic of the fight, how it looks, is going to be very similar to what we saw in the Phoenix Ayala fight. Phoenix Ayala, who is now trained by Rick Ramos, who also happens to train Jessica McCaskill. I think that tomorrow's fight is going to look a lot like that fight, where the edge in speed, the flick jab, is going to have its role to play, and what we might see is a very flustered Wilder-Suarez. unable to deal with the accuracy, the mobility, the maneuvering tactics of Marie-Eve Deker. That's the situation I see, because Marie-Eve Deker could quite honestly beat her to the punch at every turn. She's got the kind of quickness, the kind of accuracy that can really demoralize a fighter if they don't have the appropriate tools to contend. And Ogledes, God bless her, she just ain't got it. She ain't got the hand speed, she ain't got the foot speed for the job. She's quite flat-footed, to be honest, and maybe that translates into more power on the punches, but the only way that matters is if you can land them. And I don't see that happening for Ogledes in this situation. I see her being outworked, I see her being tagged, I see her being outpointed. So I've got Marie-Eve Deker retaining her IBF title tomorrow when she defends it against Caire-Suarez. I'm going with Marie-Eve Deker by way of a points decision. We then come to the super middleweight contest between the reigning WBA and Ring Magazine champion, the consensus #1 at the weight, Mr. Callum Smith, in defense of his titles against his mandatory challenger, the very game, very scrappy, John Ryder. I'll tell you that Callum Smith has everything to win this fight and win this fight comfortably, because he's not just a physically imposing fighter, he's not just very statuesque for the weight, standing in at about 6'3", but he actually uses it. He knows how to keep the punches straight, the punches long, and the distance difficult for the other man to close. In this situation, that man is John Ryder, who stands in at about 5'9" to Callum Smith, who's about 6'3". You know, and Smith is a jabber. Smith is a jabber. He's got a good stiff jab, good straight right hand, good counter right hand, which he showed in the George Groves fight. George Groves, who many would say is a more elusive, harder guy to hit than John is, yet Callum Smith put him down and put him out. Nonetheless, this situation, it really is a tall ask, a tall order, pun intended. So old John Ryder to try to close that gap and land the kind of quality shots that he would need to land to win this fight. I just don't see it happening that way, because Callum Smith is not one of these statuesque beanpole fighters that gives up their height to the smaller man, thereby making their job much more difficult than it needs to be. Callum Smith does use that height, he does use that length, he does fight behind that jab, he's got a great straight right hand, and I don't see this going the way of Fielding versus Ryder, to where the taller guy is just fighting in a phone booth for some fucking reason when he really doesn't have to. I see Callum Smith potentially knocking out a very game, a very tough John Ryder inside of, I don't know, 8 to 7 rounds. It could happen that way, because Callum Smith is a little better than advertised. I think people forget just how good and how well-rounded Callum is because they don't see him that much. You know, if he were a more busy, more active fighter, you know, you wouldn't have to jog people's memories as far as what he's capable of. But Callum Smith is indeed very formidable, very educated puncher, very polished boxer.
He hits hard.
And in spite of John's best efforts, I don't see him winning this fight. You know, maybe this gets scrappy in spots, because John's got to employ all the little guy tactics. He's got to try to slip that jab, get past it, get close enough to Callum to where he can go to his body, maybe shoot some uppercuts. That's what he's got to do to try and win the fight. I just don't see it happening. I think John's going to go out there, he's going to do his best, he's going to give it as spirited an effort as his body will allow him. He's probably on a high that he's on a 4-fight winning streak, and he won all 4 of those fights by way of knockout or technical knockout, so in all likelihood, John is feeling very confident. He's feeling himself, and he's going to put that effort forth, but I just don't see it working out for him, because Callum Smith really is one of the better fighters, one of the better champions in the super middleweight division. He is not the weakest link by any stretch of the imagination, and people tend to forget that because Callum doesn't keep the busiest schedule. Had he, you know, people would know more about the guy. Better still, I do see this fight ending by way of knockout or technical knockout inside of 8 to 7 rounds. I'd be surprised if it didn't, and that's how I've got it. I've got Callum Smith retaining both the Ring Magazine and WBA titles. I'm sure that most of you have heard by now in regards to tomorrow night's fight that, you know, Nery versus Rodriguez is off. Rodriguez would not accept terms for the fight to continue after Luis Nery blew weight once again, and this has been a recurring theme with Luis Nery ever since he got popped for clenbuterol after the first Yamanaka fight. I mean, is it really a coincidence that he gets popped for a weight-cutting agent, then subsequently blows the weight in the following fight with Yamanaka, the rematch? You know, he blew weight ahead of the rematch. And here he is blowing it yet again. Look, I don't want to hear about Luis Nery versus Naoya Inoue and how he would destroy him when this guy can't even beat the scales. Okay, clearly Luis Nery is not cut out for 118 pounds, and what he needs to do is move up, because he doesn't appear to be much. He's nothing without his Clenbow stakes, and I'm a little ticked over this particular development because I was actually looking forward to that fight. That for me was the most intriguing fight on the card. Luis Nery versus Emmanuel Rodriguez, and how does Nery handle him? Yet Nery can't handle so much as a weight cut, much less a fight that would align him for a full world title shot. So, you know, I don't want to hear any more about Luis Nery. I don't want to hear the Nery versus Inoue, Nery versus Ubali, Nery versus Tete conversation. That guy, you know, he needs to get it together and move up, because clearly that's what his body is telling him to do. In regards to the Wilder versus Ortiz rematch, this is yet another fight where I have very few thoughts, because, you know, Wilder's not a tactician. He's not the kind of guy that goes into a fight, starts making adjustments and things like that. Wilder is very much relying on the big right hand to prevail, the same way he always does. And in the case of Luis Ortiz, while he is more of a tactician, while he is more of a polished boxer, he is still the much older fighter in the fight. He's a little trimmer, he's got a new haircut, but bells and whistles aside, I'm expecting this fight to go the same way that the first fight did, that Luis Ortiz might have some success early, buy himself some time, land a couple of interesting shots on Wilder, who's no defensive wizard. He's not blessed in that area. But all things considered, this fight likely ends the same way that the first fight did, and it might even end sooner than that, because Luis Ortiz has not been looking like the boogeyman, like King Kong, his last couple of fights. So what is there to reflect upon there?
Not a lot.
I got Wilder stopping Ortiz in the same fucking fashion that I had him stopping Ortiz in the first fight. It's a byproduct of a refurbished fight. There's no real intrigue because the fight was orchestrated for the wrong reasons. So I've got Wilder by way of knockout tomorrow night. And most of the intrigue in association with this rematch has more to do with what the fighters are being paid, what is being reported. You see, the Nevada State Athletic Commission released the guaranteed purses to the fighters, and you know, it's substantially less than what Wilder's fans would want you to believe. That, you know, Wilder's only guaranteed 3 and Ortiz is only really guaranteed 1. Yet a tweet, a report from one Dan Raphael is suggesting that the fighters actually stand to make more than that from a separate guarantee, that Wilder stands to make something to the tune of, you know, close to $20 million, it being that he was guaranteed this amount for rejecting the DAZN offer months ago. And this is the guarantee that I've been talking to you guys about all along, that they had to compensate him for rejecting that $20 million for the Brazil fight. They had to give him something for his troubles for having rejected that. And while it may not total $20 million, they had to give him something. And this is likely the guarantee that Dan Raphael was referring to, because Wilder was overpaid for that Dominic Brazil fight. In all honesty, whether they gave him a flat 9, a flat 12, or a flat 18, because there's all sorts of numbers floating around out there in regards to Wilder's compensation for rejecting the DAZN's offer. Regardless of what he was given, it's pretty clear that they didn't give him that big cash guarantee, that compensation, because they thought the Brazil fight was going to make so much money. That's not why they overpaid Wilder. They overpaid Wilder because the DAZN offered him $20 million to cross over. So they had to compete with that. And in that way, it's not Wilder's earning power or his market value that got him that money. It was DAZN's offer.
Pretty much.
You really ought to be thanking Eddie Hearn and John Skipper that they even offered him that money, because had they not offered him that money, well, he never would have got that compensation from Showtime and the PBC. The only reason they gave him that was so that he would stay on their side of the street. So what was he going to get before DAZN offered him $20 million for Brazil? You know, what was he going to get before that?
Think about it.
I'll tell you, this is creating more confusion than it should, because this isn't exactly breaking news. It wasn't a secret or a recent development that Wilder was given a cash incentive to not take DAZN's offer. This is actually old news, and I guess that everybody forgot.
It happens.
But as far as how much money is being poured into this event, you know, Wilder's cash incentive to stay on the PBC side of things, Luis Ortiz supposedly making something to the tune of $7 million. I mean, if all of this checks out, then it's almost a guarantee that this pay-per-view is going to be a flop, a blunder. That if it doesn't do anything north of $4 400,000 to 500,000 pay-per-view buys, this thing is a flop. It is a financial bloodbath. You can't be expecting to generate that many pay-per-view buys to where Wilder gets 20 million off this fight and Ortiz gets 7 million off this fight, because then that would basically be putting the number for this fight as more than what you got for the Fury fight. The Fury fight pulled in 24 million off of pay-per-view buys. 325,000 pay-per-view buys multiplied by $75 a buy equals roughly $24 million. At the gate, the live gate, it pulled in a very modest
$3.5 million.
$3.5 million. That's roughly $27 million total.
For the whole fucking thing.
Whereas here, we're supposed to believe that $27 million is going to just paying the fighters. That's not counting the break-even point and getting back what was put into the event, the profit that the networks want to make off of this thing. I mean, you got to be slow. You got to be bad at math to not see that the numbers, they're not quite adding up. So in all honesty, if these dollar amounts,
hypothetically speaking,
if we're to entertain this, that these dollar amounts are being awarded to these fighters, then it's almost a guarantee that this pay-per-view is a flop, unless it does something like 500 or 600,000 pay-per-view buys. That's what it would have to do to justify the spending that's going into it. It's a flop. And the hope here seems to be that while this event might flop, they'll make the money back in the Tyson-Fury rematches. Not rematch, rematches. That's plural. That means more than one.
So let's put this in layman's terms that stupid people can understand. Months ago, they gave Wilder a guarantee to make sure he rejected his own offer, and he did that. But they're not going to see a return for all the money they invested in Wilder for some time. They certainly won't see it from this fight, because this fight is estimated to get less pay-per-view buys than the Fury fight. In order for this fight to not be a complete loss, it'd have to do, I don't know, something like maybe 4, 5, maybe even 600,000 pay-per-view buys. You think they're gonna get that with this fight? The only way they're gonna recoup all the money they're wasting on Deontay Wilder is if they do astronomical numbers either with this pay-per-view or the Fury pay-per-view. And in the in-between time, Wilder's still not getting the kind of money that DAZN offered him, because they didn't just offer him $20 million. They offered him $100 million. 2 Joshua fights for $40 million apiece. When you gonna start making it? Because even with this, you're still not making the kind of dough that DAZN offered you. These guys are clawing, scratching, and sniffing to find ways to compensate this guy for money he don't even generate.
No, right?
But even when they do this, they're still not giving you the kind of money DAZN offered you. Took these guys 2 separate fights and how many months to get you that kind of money? The same kind of money that DAZN offered you on a whim. You didn't want it. You didn't want it because you wanted to stay on that side of the street. You didn't actually want the Joshua fight. You're just trying to use his name to raise your marquee value, raise your market value. That's all this guy's doing. He's a parasite, he's a barnacle, and these guys are losing a lot of money trying to sell him as something else.